here's two inconsistent beliefs a person might have. I'm good, but my behavior is bad. I'm a good person, but I'm enslaving human beings. I'm a good person, but I'm going around kicking them out of the land and murdering them. I'm a good person, but I beat my wife. These are inconsistent, so how can these be rationalized? Well, what psychologists have learned is that if your behavior really is bad or it's hurtful, the logical, the reasonable thing would be to say, gee, I'm really not so good, I ought to change my behavior. But that's not what most human beings do. They change this and rationalize their behavior. Cognitive dissonance means you have this disharmony of beliefs, and then you rationalize your behavior so that you have consistent beliefs, but you do it so that you can maintain believing you're a good and smart person. Otherwise, it would be too devastating to your self-esteem. It would just be too psychologically devastating. So you simply rationalize your behavior. And so, not that many Jews got killed, and I was just following orders, and they deserved it anyway. Yeah, rationalization. But this happens in the case of religion as well. This idea of sacred constraint is a myth because you can look at and just take the Christian Bible, for example. You have a couple thousand pages or whatever, and you have so much in there that the slightest, and I mean the slightest ambiguity, vagueness, or inconsistency will allow people to rationalize and justify anything that is in the text. I'm a good person, my behavior is bad, how can I say it's good? It says in there, slaves obey your masters. Those 4 words can justify all of enslavement of Africans, because even though it requires rejecting the entirety of the gospel. Because human beings say, I'm not constrained by what Jesus said, because Paul right there says, slaves obey your masters. Therefore he's justifying, he's rational, he's defending slavery. And so the point is, because any sacred text has vagueness and ambiguity and inconsistency, human beings can rationalize anything they want to do from just about any sacred text. So this is simply a myth. We can do all kinds of examples of this. I guess a common example I like to look at today is discrimination against gays and lesbians. You have the entirety of the Gospels, and Jesus saying, love your neighbor, do unto others as you have them do unto you. Don't judge. Don't dislike or fear people simply because they're different. And yet you have a couple little words or phrases here and there in the Bible that people pick up and say, aha, we're going to discriminate against gays and lesbians, and we want them to be fired from their jobs and kicked out of their apartments by their landlords, and their kids taken away and denied marriage and so on. There's no sacred constraint going on there. Again, you can look at all throughout history, and the point is, it's a myth. Because human beings will simply rationalize anything they want to do if they're unreasonable. And that's the key point, if they're unreasonable. So the solution then is not to say, well, we need a particular form of religion, but simply to say, we need to have more reason. We need to have more reason and rationality. We need to improve our educational system. The kids need to be taught, logical fallacies and critical thinking skills and understanding what makes for good argument and good evidence and weighing the quality of that evidence and arguments from a very young age and do that. And our education system doesn't do that. Were you taught logical fallacies starting in elementary school? I doubt it. I certainly wasn't. Yeah, and so the system can be vastly improved. So the solution is not some kind of fundamentalist form of religion. The solution is improved education, improved family upbringing, and institutions that teach, support, and reward critical thinking. Even if this is difficult to achieve, it's still better to shoot for being more reasonable than saying, let's just throw up our hands and say, there's no hope, we're just going to turn to complete unreason and irrationality, which, as I say, isn't going to work anyway. And if human beings truly have no capacity for reason, then there isn't any hope for humanity anyway. You might just say, well, screw it, we might as well just live our lives the best we can now, and not worry about the future, not worry about trying to improve society, because it's just a matter of time before we destroy ourselves. And that may be the case, but the alternative is to say we either give up all hope or say we've got to act as if human beings have the capacity for reason and the capacity for innate goodness and work towards achieving that. I mean, that's the two honest things. So that's the main talk, but I do want to now then respond to Brian's point, and I think you should probably be able to respond to my points before we take questions. Does that sound fair? Go ahead. Yeah, okay. first I want to note that Bryan continually sets up a straw man. He keeps setting up the debate between his religion and atheism. And of course, that's not what I'm arguing. I'm not arguing for atheism at all. In fact, to me, atheism is another form of religion. Because if you are sure that there is no God, even though you can't prove there is no God or gods or whatever, well, then that's a form of fundamentalism. That's a form of unreason. And there's a big, he has this very narrow definition, basically, which is monotheism, and a particular form of monotheism with attached beliefs. And then he's saying the alternative is either that or atheism. That's very black or white. He's leaving out all of the spectrum of various types of religious beliefs in between. And so it almost seems like he's conceding that most religions are a negative political society. It's only this very narrow type of religion that is positive for a political society. And his whole argument, remember his argument initially was, well, a religion must be just. Well, who's going to determine whether the religion is just? Human beings, using their innate moral sense and reason. So his whole argument presupposes an innate human rationality and innate moral sense in order to measure and weigh which religions are truly just or not. So he's basically self-refuted his whole argument there. As far as the 20th century goes, this largely it's a historical accident. If you go back in history, look at Alexander the Great, or Xerxes, the Persian king, or Genghis Khan. I mean, they slaughtered anybody that got in their way. They went around slaughtering whole villages, men, women, and children. If the one person rose up against you, and it just so happened, though, they didn't have tanks, they didn't have guns, they didn't have planes and missiles. But if they did, and if the world population was larger at that time, there would have been tens of millions of people slaughtered by them as well. So the 20th century is in part largely a historical accident, because you had these things occurring in like Nazism and communism generally occurring in very largely populated countries, much larger populations than in older times, and with modern weaponry. So of course you're going to have a lot more people killed. And to look at Hitler as just one example, Bryan says, well, it was largely based on atheism. But here is a couple of statements made by Hitler. This is in 1922, and this was published by him. He says, my feeling as a Christian points me to my Lord and Savior as a fighter. It points me to the man who once in loneliness, surrounded by a few followers, recognized these Jews for what they were, and summoned men to fight against them. How terrific was his fight against the Jewish poison? So, and now this is in Mein Kampf. This was his basic manifesto. This is 1925. He says here, the folkish-minded man has a sacred duty of making people stop just talking superficially of God's will and actually fulfill God's will and not let God's word be desecrated. He says, here today I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator by defending myself against the Jew I am fighting for the work of the Lord. That's in Mein Kampf. Now you might make an argument, well, he was really, he wasn't really religious, he was just using this to manipulate the masses as a form of propaganda. That's exactly my point. Because if the people were saying, oh, well, if he's doing God's work, we mustn't question this. He says he's doing God's work. Well, of course we ought to, of course it's the Jews' fault. Like Mel Gibson. Well, the Jews killed Jesus. Yeah, So, he's not thinking. He's not using reason. And so that's the point, is that whether Hitler was an atheist or not is irrelevant. The point is he used the religion of the German people and manipulated it against them, because they didn't stop and think, gee, should we really kill the Jews? Should we really take over the world? But apparently the German and the Italian people had no problem going to church on Sunday, and then on Monday trying to take over the world and kill Jews. And the Japanese people as well. Oh, our God Emperor says we are the chosen people who must take over the world. And he was basically a prophet of their religion. They said yes, because they weren't thinking, gee, just because some religious figure says this, does this really mean this is a smart idea to do it? And so you have to look at that. Also, Bryan says we have to have this notion of natural rights defended by religion. If you look through all of human history, and even most of Western and Christian history, this notion of human rights is only a very recent human invention, going back a couple, 200 years. And so, notice again, if these religious texts, or say the Christian Bible or whatever, for over 1,000, 1,500 plus years, had no conception of democracy or justification of rights, and all of a sudden it can defend this whole notion of rights-based democracy. It shows that religious text is so malleable that it can be adopted to any end, which again shows there is no such thing as sacred constraint. So Bryan's own argument is self-refuting by saying that these rights offer sacred constraint, because they're a recent invention that shows you can manipulate the text to say anything you want. Oh, and let's see here. And I think there are probably other minor points I could make, but I think that that's the main rebuttal points I might make. So thank you, and Bryan, I appreciate the chance to rebuttal.
Let me just say that I've been to many academic conferences, and I've been in your position as listeners, and I just hate when the people on the podium go on and on. So let's just do it as that, and maybe open it up now, since we've gone for an hour, so you can ask some questions. It's probably the points I might say against Greg, the things that you might think of, but at all events,
All right. I'm hoping to look for your rebuttal. That's
oh, I'll give it to you tomorrow morning. We just don't have that much time.
Yeah.
But anyway, why don't we just open up for questions, since you all have been here for an hour and 20 minutes or so. I'm going to let the students go ahead and do it. Bryan, did you want to go ahead and officiate, so to speak, since you're the, as you are the political science club supervisor, but
You
otherwise.
can just start opening up to the floor, I
Go
guess.
ahead. Go ahead, yeah, you don't hear.
Dr. Frost, you were talking about how religion provides restraint for society as a whole. And I'm thinking of our society in the United States and the legality of same-sex marriage. What restraint, which behavior would that cause that would be bad, that the religious aspect of it would be restrained?
Which problem with same-sex marriage with religion restraint?
Correct. If it's a religious,
What's wrong with same-sex marriage that it needs to be restrained?
exactly.
For religion, well, I mean, you could simply say, I think the Bible's pretty categorical that homosexuality is not something tolerated in so many texts. So they would just say that that sort of behavior is something that should just not be allowed to be openly celebrated. That I think would be something they would restrain. Again, whether or not that would be a good one is the question, but there would at least be that sort of restraint there. They would simply say that that given the divine commandment to procreate, it might not be something you want to promote openly and celebrate and acknowledge with the state. I mean, it would depend on a particular religious person's belief, but even here in that respect, you could say most religions tend to be, I think the Anglican Church is probably going to be taking the lead here. It's going to be simply tolerated in the future. But the more restraints that I would be thinking of would be the restraints that you see so clearly violated in the 20th century, that there's nothing you can do against another human being if they in some way disagree with your idealization of a leader, a party, an ideology, or the state. That, I think, is where religion provides just some sort of limitation to what human beings can do left on their own.
Murder because you disagree with the person.
Yeah, or just re-education, gulag archipelagos, wholesale destruction of individuals because they disagree with an ideology. There, I think, religion provides the constraint that that you cannot simply have unless you look to reason or something else. But in terms of gay marriage, I'm not really sure what the particular restraint would there be, because that doesn't seem to me to be an issue that on the scale of which you saw, for example, in the 20th century, the sorts of general sorts of restraints that I'm speaking of. Does that sort of help?
Yes, but